before 2 more months of winter, before the next day of spring. Did you see the groundhog? Did we talk about the groundhog? The groundhog predicted 6 more weeks of winter.
Oh, yeah, I saw that too. Yeah.
So did you know the groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil, is wrong much more often than he's right?
No, I did not.
So in fact, if you would flip his predictions, you would be right more often than you'd be wrong. Did you also know that in addition to the groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil from Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, who is a legend, there's actually a whole, I don't know, army of such groundhogs throughout North America, US and Canada, that make similar predictions. And there's websites that track their, accuracy stats. And I don't remember which one it was. Some Canadian one is historically much more accurate at predicting the arrival of spring. Marco.
When they're an ensemble, right?
Yeah.
How else do they do?
That's an excellent question. So I'll try to find, or maybe look it up, find the stats and see if you can learn one from them.
This question of national importance.
Good. So you were listening. You're paying attention.
In Boulder, Colorado, they do Flatiron Freddy. It's this like old stuffed marmot that the park rangers found at the dumpster. So it's like really ragged and haggard, and they have it come in and like come into the event like different ways every time. So it's like parachuted in sometimes, that's like canoed in sometimes, and they like set it all up.
Love it.
It's called Flatiron Freddy.
Yeah, love it. I've actually met Phil in person years ago.
Yeah.
Say again?
You're on a first name basis.
I would like to think of it that way. Think of him that way. I don't know if it's mutual though.
Wait, what's the full name? How do I search this person?
Good luck spelling that. Yeah.
It's like PUNXSU. I don't know.
Oh, I found him.
He does events. So I met him in Pittsburgh once, many years ago at an event. He came with his handlers, the inner circle people, the people with the top hats and all. And you can actually visit him and his family. They live in Punxsutawney. You can visit them year round. He doesn't just come out on Groundhog's Day. He lives there with his kin. So you can go visit. I have yet to do this. I have yet to go visit him in person. And he also has lived for, I don't know, 150, 180 years, something like this. He's been around that long.
Watch this. How do they determine if he like saw the shadow or not?
Does anybody know?
Never watched that.
I think they ask him.
Can you just
So the inner circle people speak Groundhogese.
Okay, got it.
And then they talk to him and something happened. There's some magic that happens.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. Where were we? By the way, if you haven't, say again?
Sorry, I just Googled it, and the ensemble is like 50% accurate.
Ensemble is 50%?
Yeah, ensemble of this. Yeah, and the Phil is actually an underperformer. It's like 35 to 39% accurate.
Phil is how much?
35 to 39%.
Okay, yes. So just flip his predictions.
Yeah.
We actually got 6 more weeks of winter.
I mean, I suppose you look outside, I don't know, leave your classroom.
But like regionally, like we all have very different winters. So like how are you even getting the accuracy for that?
I just asked Google.
So excellent question, right? So like how far does his range of prediction or of sphere of influence stretch? Is it just Punxsutawney City? Is it all of Pennsylvania? Yeah, great question.
How do you define winter? I don't know.
So these are the kinds of inquisitive questions that good empirical researchers should ask before trusting a random groundhog's predictions.
Like the most of the groundhogs.
He is by far, yes. That's why they made movies after him and not the other 20.
Other ones are less important, so there's a feeling to be weighted more.
Arguably, places like, I don't know, California and many parts don't experience winter at all, like San Diego. So then.
But he's still the most relevant, so his prediction.
I heard this rumor, so my wife is not as excited about Phil as I am. Allegedly, he bites. I refuse to believe this, even if it's true. Okay, back to business. By the way, you should check out this Pittsburgh photographer. I always use his photos because they're so awesome. He used to have a physical store, but he would sell prints. I don't think that's the case anymore. Maybe that like stopped during the pandemic. Dave DiCello is his name. He has a social media presence and always posts all of these photos. I historically have used the ones from the day of the class or right the day before or something, just to to remember what Pittsburgh was like at the time when we had those lectures. So this is what Pittsburgh was like over the weekend. Okay, so today I want to talk about that thing's in the way and annoying. I want to talk about what we do after we run some interviews. By the way, I was surprised that only a couple of you have volunteered interview transcripts for dissection. Thank you very much. Does that mean you're still doing interviews, the rest of you? Or just prefer not to share them?
We just finished right before class.
Okay.
Yes, I can share them.
I can share
I just
them
thought,
right now.
I thought that a lot of people might have shared them already, but.
Okay, so it's just,
Twice.
got it. Yeah, tragedy of the commons is what happened. Right, fair enough. I have 3 examples right now, which will be enough for class today, so we could work on that. All right, so today we're going to focus on the analysis of this data you've collected from interviews. If you look in our folder of readings, there's a ton of amazing stuff that I highly recommend you look at for how to do all of this. You will find them all there. So this is kind of what the lecture is based on, but it's a very heavily summarized version of all of this. Okay, so main question is, how do you go from data you've collected through interviews, from that to rigorous science, which is maybe different from journalism? So 2 steps. I think we talked quite a bit at the end of lecture last time when we read this paper. So we talked about this idea of coding, the process of coding, and we talked about finding patterns in codes, which was maybe most commonly some form of grounded theory or grounded theory light. We talked about thematic analysis at high level. I'll have more details about both of these now. Okay, so coding is summarizing data. It's a summarization step. You could have different types of codes. This is something you yourselves assign, the researchers, or your favorite LLM, depending on how much you want to experiment with this. They could be descriptive. So for example, you have some transcript, a passage from a transcript from an interview, something like this. And you could describe in one label what this was about. In this case, maybe it was about the businesses the person was walking past on their way to school or something. If you don't want to make up a label, you could pull one directly from the transcripts. That's often a good strategy. So here you see these quoted labels as being verbatim things the participant has said, hated school or stopped caring or whatever else, right? These are parts of the actual transcript. You could use these as codes. You could use actions as codes, so ing words, spreading rumors or gossip. This would be my favorite. Knowing what you said and so forth. These could be also things like emotions, how the participants felt. Could be things they say explicitly, could be things you infer as researchers based on what they're saying. Another type of codes that is often used is the sort of values, attitudes, beliefs style. You can get a sense for what this is like. Okay, so we, I think, talked a bit about how you start doing this, kind of one interview transcript at a time. Maybe you have a start list of codes. when might you have a star list of codes as opposed to trying to create them from scratch? Does that happen, Andy?
Maybe there's some existing theory that you're building off of.
Excellent, right? So that's often a great way to start with existing codes as opposed to inventing new ones, right? You start with an existing theory. You can still add new ones if the theory doesn't fit, that's fine. But that's often a starting point. Or alternatively, if for example, you start from work that another person on the research team has done, maybe they've already developed a preliminary code book or something, you could start from that and work on refining it. That's another example. Yeah, we talked about this. Yes. Okay. You could also think of the coding process as, or you could do in a way hypothesis testing, not in a statistical sense, but in a kind of theory fit sense. You could think of the coding process as allowing for that as well. You could apply existing codes, for example, from some starting theory you go into the study with to assess some hypothesis you're looking to test. By test here, I don't mean test in a statistical, numerical, quantitative sense, but in a sort of analytical sense. Right, or you could be looking for causes or explanations or mechanisms. You're trying to test, find evidence for these different mechanisms in the data. Okay, so coding, deductive versus inductive. Deductive is when you start from some existing set of codes. Inductive is when you build the codes from scratch. It's one consideration. I think most often you'll be doing inductive coding, if I were to guess. Good to do analysis concurrently with data collection. We talked a lot about this, about how you should start coding and analyzing your interview transcripts as soon as you can before finishing with all the remaining interviews. This will help you find blind spots and so on, what new data to collect, what questions to add to your protocol. It's also important to keep detailed records of all of these decisions you're making, specifically operational definitions of the codes and example quotes from the transcripts are super useful. You should always try to do this. Right? So, if you use a tool like, I don't know, atlas.ti is something that I've heard people use for this kind of qualitative analysis. I don't know, has anybody tried it? There is a tool, atlas.ti, that can help with this. Maybe there are others, or you could do this, from scratch by hand. There's not a lot to it, but the idea is, when you decide to code something a certain way, you want to write down an operational definition for that label and record a few examples so that you yourself can go back to this and decide later when you see another instance of the same thing, whether the same code applies. And much more importantly, your colleagues on the research team or readers at large of your paper once you get it published. Okay. Right, so how detailed should you code? Should you code every sentence? Should you code every sentence in the whole transcript? How detailed? So what do you think here? How do you decide? Right, so I'm saying not every block of text should be coded, and some parts can be coded in more than one way at the same time. Like, how do you decide on this? What's the driving force here?
The research question.
That's it, the research question, right? So it's very likely that your interview transcript will contain all kinds of details that are not directly relevant for your research question. So those you will safely skip when you're doing this kind of analysis. You will focus on the parts of your transcripts that have some relation to your research question. Okay? And you can decide to skip other parts.
What does operational mean then?
Operational means in practice. Where is it?
Clear operational definition.
Yes. So Right, so definitions. How do you, what does that look like in practice? You know, if you have a code that says, actually, let me give you, do I have an example? Yeah, here's an example. So this is from a study that we did in my group a few years ago, where we looked at issue discussions on GitHub and ways in which people are being toxic in their comments that they leave on these issue discussions. There's some definition of what toxic means. So here, you know, we have a bunch of codes. These would be, for example, the things under label. Right? These would be things we would be coding in our transcripts. And then definition is, you know, what does that look like, right? The code is one label. The definition helps you understand what that means and what that looks like in practice, so that when you see another one of the same instance, you can apply it uniformly. So it's just the definition, you know, how do you decide if it's you know, entitled or not? What does entitled mean, right? If I just use the label entitled, which is somewhere there in the middle, I have no way of highlighting this. You know, that means here condescending or arrogant tone in a comment or request, as if the author is above the others in the thread, right? So this is the operational definition of the entitled code, right? And then, you know, whenever we see more instances of this kind of behavior, we also code those as entitled. So
It's a formalization.
just yes, it's a formalization, you know, as simple as just defining it so that you yourself can apply it consistently and so that others can know what you meant when you said this. Yeah.
Why do you have definitions for some of the label?
Excellent question. That is to be answered some other time.
Probably an old snapshot.
Yeah, we should have definitions for all of the codes or all the labels. I don't know right now why we are missing some.
Also, in the coding process, even if you start with a reductive approach, it can still go inductive, right?
Sure, meaning you can add to it or sure. Yeah, you can always, yes.
So in that case, it's not just reductive, it's other things.
It's usually one or the other. In my experience, it's usually inductive. You usually do interviews when you have an open-ended exploratory research question and not typically a theory going in. So it becomes inductive. And otherwise, you do interviews sometimes deductively to confirm something you've observed otherwise, maybe through a quantitative study or something like
But
this.
if you observe something different from what they have done, you make your own new code book.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Does that make sense about definitions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So by the way, so something like this, right, where you write down and maintain throughout your study your documents like these, where you list your code book, list the definitions of all of your codes, not just some of the codes, okay, like the people did here, and also example quotes for each of these. At the very least, this is the expected best practice here. And you maintain a code book with definitions and example quotes throughout the study. In fact, it's probably a best practice to publish this artifact together with your paper, supplementary materials or something like this. Right? In your paper, you won't go into as much detail about these things, right? The paper will be a summary, but it's good to include this artifact in the supplementary materials together, for example, with the interview protocol itself. There's discussion also around publishing all of the transcripts as well. So this may be appropriate if you obtain consent from the participants and you properly de-identify and anonymize them. Otherwise it could be sensitive, but that's sort of a decision you would have to make. It is good practice though when possible, right, to be as transparent about all of the details of the study as possible. And I'll have even a checklist later on that you can refer to for this. Okay, so now magic incantation of clicks to make the stuff go away again. Okay, we talked about this. Yeah, from the same study, this is how we did this in practice at the time, just as an example. So here, Courtney printed out all of these documents that she was trying to code and was using, highlighting and handwriting annotations and sticky notes to do this kind of coding. Right, so you could do this very analog, like here. You could do this entirely digitally with a tool like Atlas TI, or you could do this in a Google spreadsheet or something. If you have collaborators, you can sort of together look at something in that format. The format doesn't really matter. It's the process that's important. Use whatever tools and format, I don't know, makes sense to you or you have available. But the process is what's important. Okay. So this was coding, right? Coding is labeling, slightly summarizing the raw data. There's not much analysis beyond that just yet. Okay? And I think we talked last time about how you iteratively refine this code book, right? You go back and you decide to change the definition of a label or change the label or merge two labels or whatever it may be, right? So this is sort of an iterative process. And only towards the end do you stabilize this artifact. This is also why it's good to maintain this artifact throughout the process so that you remember all of these decisions that you've made. Okay, so what happens next, right? You have now data that you can work with more easily in some condensed format. It's already coded or labeled. By the way, codes and coding are the technical terms here, not labeling. This isn't like machine learning labeling of data, although it feels that way. The technical term is coding. Even though I call them labels in my previous spreadsheet, by the way. Okay, so the most common form of analysis will likely be thematic analysis, which means you synthesize emerging themes from these different codes that capture groupings of these. You're trying to, like, usually you have dozens, maybe hundreds of codes as a result of this first pass. So at that granularity, it's hard to make much sense of this and not particularly useful for reporting in say, a paper. So usually you want to condense that down to some emergent themes, right, that group together a bunch of these related codes. This is the simplest form of analysis you could think of. It's descriptive. It doesn't really do much about causal mechanisms or relationships or what have you. It's just trying to further aggregate and synthesize the codes into themes. So how do you do this? So one common method that everybody uses is called card sorting. Have you heard this term? Some nods, a couple of nods, not many. Okay, so card sorting is like the name implies. So here you see a photo of one of these conference tables in one of our offices. The code book are these sticky notes, the post-it notes, the yellow ones. Each of those is a code, and underneath them is a stack of quotes. We were doing this old school analog, pen and paper. Okay? So card sorting, you take the first code, right, the first card, each code is a card. You take the first card. Because it's the first one, it's its own category. You put it down on the table. Like, take the second card, look at what's on the table. Is this another instance? Is this related to the first one? Yes or no. If it's related, you put it in the same pile. If it's a completely different thing, you make a second pile. You start a new pile, right? And then you keep doing this together with other co-authors and you sort of iteratively, and you agree on this and refine this. And at some point you have one where you realize that you should have done something different earlier, and then you go back and redo that part. Okay. So with something like this, card sorting, you arrive at these higher level groupings of codes into emergent themes. That makes sense? So here, in the study that I mentioned, the emergent themes were these bigger boxes that you see here, right? Had to do with the nature of the toxic comments. So in what ways were these different comments toxic? Had to do with the author, who was the person issuing this comment? Who was the target of the comment? Were they being toxic at themselves? Were they being toxic in the void at the computer? Were they being toxic towards another collaborator, etc.? Right? What's the context and so forth, right? So these were sort of emerging themes from this process of coding.
Here, the yes and no are tools for large project, active project in severe language.
Yeah. So okay. So good. Yes, they are. Let me see if I have a. Yeah, I don't know if I have. It will take me too long to look for it. I have something about this, but I'll just tell you directly. In the meantime, we were here. So not all of these codes were inductive in our case. It was a combination of inductive things where we didn't know what we were looking for, and we just analyzed the data to see what we should be looking for, and things that we wanted to look for going in. So this was a combination of inductive and deductive. In this case, the deductive parts had to do with some of these dimensions, along which we expected there would be interesting differences. So this was maybe our theory, if you will, going in. We had some theory, some hypotheses going into the study, but not enough to do everything top down this way. But we had some. So we had some dimensions that we expected could be relevant, and we wanted to distinguish, to code on those explicitly, which is why you see them being very simple like this. They're just sort of categorizations.
Themes existed before codes.
So this was an excellent observation. Yeah, so this is a combination of inductive and deductive, right? The deductive part you see represented in these bits, where we were just looking for these bifurcations. And then the inductive part were things that we did not expect. So for example, nature of toxicity, we had no theory going into this. We had no expectation about what that looks like. So all of those types of toxic comments were all emerging from the data, right? In this sort of inductive bottom-up fashion. So that's what, yeah.
And here you had hypothesis that you'll find civil language in some, you won't find in some, so they were two different.
Yes, we wanted to study if that's the case, if there's any qualitative difference. For example, sure, let's talk about it. So with something like thematic analysis, you usually stop at reporting the themes, right? So this is a descriptive analysis. The goal, so your resulting theory is just the set of themes, the set of categories. You don't really go beyond this to look for relationships between themes and higher order constructs. Right? So, the most vanilla thing you could do is just report the themes. Maybe you're studying, challenges that people are having, that scientists are having when using Gen AI tools. And you find, 5 types, 5 themes, 5 types of challenges, and you just list what those 5 types are, right? The end. Right? The end of the analysis and the end of the paper, potentially. Right? So this is the most basic thing you could do. Here, we wanted to go one step further and look for additional relationships between these different themes to kind of really build towards a theory that has not just the constructs, but also the relationships between them, maybe something about the mechanisms, maybe something about, predictions and so forth. So this distinction here, right, allows us to do this kind of relationship analysis here. For example, if we look at different levels of activity of these projects, do we observe toxicity of different nature? Okay, so like we're building connections across themes, right, to build these relationships. But this is going more towards, theory in a true sense than just describing the categories.
So like kind of go the level above just doing thematic analysis, you run the risk of like over extrapolating and like kind of like over assuming certain parts of the model. So how do you
Sure.
avoid falling into those traps, at least from like, I feel like it's very easy to kind of point to like a false correlation or something like that.
So all of these are hypotheses. There's no, at this level of relationships and predictions, right? So for example, you might hypothesize, you might make a prediction that the size of the project or the level of maturity of the project makes a difference when it comes to the incidence or the nature of toxicity. But this is exactly that. It's a hypothesis, right? You would need a different study, right, on top of this that goes and tests this empirically, right? So the most you could do with something like this is hypothesize, generate hypotheses. And if you remember the what was it? The marketing thing, what was it? Impulse buying paper?
Mm-hmm.
Remember the impulse buying paper that we read, I don't know, a week ago or whenever? They did an interview study that resulted in a list of hypotheses. And then they did a whole second study as part of the same paper where they tried to, statistically test those hypotheses using different new data that they collected afterwards. So here, right, you're not making those claims, is what I'm saying. You're not making those claims about these correlations, as you call them, right? You're generating these hypotheses that have yet to be tested. Right? So essentially, this is still speculation, right? This is not evidence yet. Or it's, very small scale evidence, if you will.
I still don't understand what was the point about the yes and no versus those categories. You said the nature, triggers and all, those are inductive.
Right. So we could have done a study where we just focused on that and reported on the types of toxicity that we encountered when we study comments on this platform. Right? Here are a set of categories, with different kinds of elements in them. We could have given quotes and whatnot to substantiate all of those. We could have done that, right? Would have been descriptive categorization of this phenomenon, right? I'm saying you could go one step further towards a real theory, right? Theories have, not just constructs, but relationships between them, and you can make predictions and so forth. Propositions, right?
That's where you're coding the yes and no and all that stuff.
Right. So like this additional component of deductive coding allowed us to do more of that.
But now we don't need any of this, right? We just put all the transcripts together and then ask it to give us the. Right?
Do you expect an answer to this comment?
Yeah.
That you just put the transcripts in an
Yeah,
LLM?
because I didn't see them in slide. Any of that, don't do this anymore.
So, okay, so fine, we could talk about this too. I am very much pro AI when it comes to using AI for research. In fact, I have used AI for qualitative analysis and thematic analysis. I think you can do a lot with an LLM on this. The part that is still hard to automate, I think, is this understanding of what to look for that a domain expert researcher brings after being familiar with all the literature in that area and being in that space for a long time. So I think you can get something that's very plausible looking automatically from an LLM, but to what extent you can sell that in a top tier paper to your like peer audience in a way that builds on the literature and so forth and addresses a real gap and has sort of good interpretation and discussion and so forth. I think that's harder and still requires a bit of human taste.
Yeah, just to add to your point and to answer Shyam's question, I found the Empirical study last year on like trying to analyze our like data scraped from GitHub, and we came up with codes for different kinds of characteristics of different bugs that we had pulled from GitHub, and so we manually labeled 100 different bugs, and this was like the exact question I had: can we like continue this analysis with AI with like few shot learning and software? And we performed a test where we took our manually labeled data, which was private, no AI is trained on it, so it's like completely fresh data, and we tried to check the precision, and it barely touched 60%, which is just not acceptable for any kind of empirical studies in top tier conferences. Like the error rate keeps compounding the more analysis we perform. So I don't think we're there yet.
I actually, if anywhere, I think this kind of labeling is where if we're not already there, I think we'll be there very soon. I think this is the least hard of all of this. I think the harder parts are this relationship building, and it's like the next level above this categorization. I think the categorization is the least hard of all of these.
Do we have any ML perspectives here too? Like I feel like in ML venues, people are doing all sorts of things, and that's considered rigorous there. This is just an SE perspective, right? That we shouldn't do AI for all of this categorization and taping out.
Funny you should say, qualitative analysis, qualitative content analysis is absolutely not an SC research method. It's a research method that has enormously long history in all kinds of disciplines, much before computer science even existed. So it's not an SC versus ML thing. It's behavioral social science thing that has been around forever and has very high standards of rigor. Yeah, Anu?
Very similar experience to Trey, where I did not do the task that like an LM got about 60% the correct answers, and that was not sufficient.
And
Oh,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
The other thing that I have observed people doing is they'll use LM as a judge and then have the agreement. I think this is what they do with AI, and or at least this is what I've seen. And if it's like a close enough agreement, they'll just like do the rest of whatever task using LM as a judge. And that's just, I just was thinking this.
Yeah.
Two
Marco?
things. One, that is something that I've also seen where it's like, there's one way that they tested an LLM as a judge where they had a human, code these certain, it was like log files. So it had a human code it and had LLM code it and said, okay, good enough. And then they shipped the LLM as a judge as like the actual product itself. But the thing that I wanted to ask about for a while was
you said that this progress is very rigorous, right? There's high standards for what is accepted as what's for the process.
Mm.
When you're doing this inductively, where you have no expectation of those bridges,
Yeah.
it feels to me intuitively very like subjective, where it's like whatever you think it is, it is. How would you like argue this if someone's saying, "Oh, I think that's your, that's your opinion. All these codes that came out were just your interpretation. I think it's wrong." How do you say this is widespread?
Okay, so two reactions to this. One kind of a broader reaction that addresses what I perceive to be some confusion from earlier. Data labeling is analogous to coding here in the first part of this to a large extent. Right, so this is maybe what you can do with LLMs with some high reliability, or I guess in your experiences maybe not so high, but let's say high reliability. That is really not the interesting part of qualitative analysis and grounded theory building, right? The interesting part is the next part after that, where you do this higher level aggregation and relationship formation and look for mechanisms and so forth. That part is much harder to automate this way. That part requires a lot of human researcher taste and understanding of the literature and so forth. So I think there's a lot more than just the labeling part. And even the labeling part, like we talked about different kinds of codes here. So like even that's not quite as straightforward. But even if you could do coding per se entirely automatically, I expect you won't be able to do the next steps after that, right? That are analytically at higher levels of reasoning every time as easily. Point number two, subjectivity does not mean lack of rigor. So yes, the process is fundamentally subjective, which is what makes it so necessarily human still. It is you, the expert researcher, right, that come in with your perspective on the field and the literature and all of that can, pick up on what is interesting to code for and pick up on and what is not, right? What you can safely skip. We had this discussion earlier about, do you code literally everything? And how do you code, right? So it's you, right, that injects your taste in the process that makes this, I think, hard to automate away, right? And so, but that does not mean, so subjective in the sense, does not mean it's unrigorous, right? The rigor comes from, documenting the process clearly, from, all of these other things, right, that you're doing to increase the credibility, right, into how you arrived at those findings, right? Even though I could, in principle, arrive at different findings by analyzing the same input data myself.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question was not really about like automating in a way, as it was about like when I apply my taste and I arrive at these different codes or these different groupings or relationships, how do I know it's the best one that I can do or the best one? And I guess the answer is there's not.
There's no such thing, I think. Yeah.
I was talking to an ML researcher yesterday for my interview, Empirical methods class interview. And we were having some discussion about something where I mentioned, oh, there's a lot of qualitative stuff that you do like these interviews. And his statement was, oh, these interviews are a scam because it's just so subjective. And how do I trust what 50 people are saying is representative of what the answer to your research question is? So
Okay.
even before my interview started, he told me it's a scam, whatever.
But remember, qualitative exploratory studies, we don't do to ensure representativeness. To make claims about representativeness, we do, quantitative, numerical, large-scale studies, or random sample studies, or what have you. Okay? We do qualitative studies to understand all of the facets of, a problem, even if statistically, some of these opinions may be less frequent, right? So the goal is, rich understanding of the problem from all kinds of perspectives. The goal is not, counting. Any more on this? What a lively debate. I did not expect this would be so controversial.
Can we say that you said that the subjective voting does not necessarily mean lack of rigor?
Yeah.
And
How-
would there be a bias that creeps in if something, as a researcher, I'm seeing which is contradicting the current beliefs about where the research field is?
Sure, lots. Yeah. We'll talk about biases probably very soon.
Okay?
Yeah. So let me hold the answer to this for a bit. Okay, so now let's see. Okay. Yeah, so you can look at this afterwards. More than one way to find patterns. You can see some examples here of how maybe the most obvious way is not the best way. So this kind of goes a bit into Marco's question. Let me skip this. You can also use visualization. So this is again going this extra step beyond just categorization. Is looking for relationships, looking for possible causal paths, looking for mechanisms. Right, so you could be drawing these kinds of diagrams to help you make sense of these relationships between these themes that have emerged from your previous stage. Yeah, quick word of caution. The term grounded theory is very abused. It has a very specific technical meaning and very specific standards for how to do it and standards for rigor. Often people claim that they have done grounded theory in some research paper, and technically they have not. So this was an interesting paper that's a part of the reading set here, that appeared in the Academy of Management journal, complaining about people being loose with their use or misuse of the terms here. Often used as a rhetorical sleight of hand by authors who are unfamiliar with qualitative research and who wish to avoid close description or elimination of their methods. More disturbing is that it becomes apparent when one pushes them to describe their methods that many authors hold some serious misconceptions about grounded theory. Kind of, very strong language here, very strong opinions. However, in our experience, grounded theory seems increasingly to be used in a way that is essentially grounded theory light. Set of procedures for coding data very much akin to thematic analysis. And you can read the rest of this. So the I guess advice is there are very knowledgeable people, even in technical CS fields like software engineering, where many of you publish, very knowledgeable people about qualitative methods and grounded theory. And they will be very angry if you claim that you've done grounded theory without actually having done so. So think carefully about this distinction between thematic analysis, which is often what you will do in a lot of this technical CS research, and true grounded theory in a strict sense. Okay, so then more about the process.
I'm still not sure if I quite understand the difference between grounded theory and thematic analysis.
Right,
I
so
thought like thematic analysis is a step within the overall grounded theory process.
right. Except if you stop there without doing the other steps, they're saying, you should not claim that you've done grounded theory.
Okay.
Right? You either do the whole thing, in which case you can claim that you've done it, or anything else, you have no bragging rights.
Wait, what is grounded theory? We didn't discuss this.
So it's best if you look at the readings, I think, for some of this. It's we discussed a bit. It's sort of going all the way to theory and relationships and propositions and all of that, like proper theory. This is a decades-long debate here about what counts and there's two schools of thought about how to do grounded theory. They have opposing views. There's a long history here, which I will skip for the purposes of this audience. Usually, I usually do. But you can look at all of the stuff in the readings. All right. So we talked about memoing. Memoing is this process of taking notes. You should always do this. So this is an example of an analytic memo that we created and maintained throughout the study that I mentioned earlier. So this has some codes and has some of our notes about those codes as we were reading. There's different columns for different authors as we were reading this. So you can think of this as, generating assertions and propositions, right? Generating hypotheses as you're coding and analyzing the data, right? You're writing these things down as you're analyzing the data. And then this is what will serve as the input for what ends up being in your paper ultimately, right? So you start from this and make sense of this, for the final product here. So basically, keep notes of all of this stuff as you're understanding, making sense of the data, and generating hypotheses. Okay, do that clearly in writing and maintain that throughout the process is the ask. Right, so these are literal hypotheses, right, that we are speculating based on what we are seeing in the data, right? And we're keeping track of these. This will help us later on, come back and make sense of these, identify these relationships between these themes and so forth. Okay, right. So what's the standard for rigor for all of this? So some sources of bias in this kind of analysis, back to Marco's question. One obvious one, finding patterns when there aren't any. You're sort of misinterpreting something in the data that wasn't there. People sometimes talk about elite bias. This is where you're more likely to lean on the input from your high status interviewees and discard, input from your lower status interviewees. All kinds of personal biases about, I don't know, anything really. So all of those can come in. Or, ultimately you can entirely go native, as they say, and lose your outsider perspective and sort of not be able to sort of reflect on what you're hearing from an outsider's perspective. Okay, so how do you reduce the risk of some of these biases compromising your analysis? The term they use here is confirmability. So this is, I don't know, the word for trust, confirmability. And there are 3 dimensions to this, 3 things to try to optimize for as you're doing this kind of analysis. Credibility is one. Transferability is the second. And dependability is the third. These are technical terms that people use when describing these kinds of criteria. Credibility is most akin to validity in, I don't know, sort of traditional empirical studies or numerical statistical empirical studies. We talked about threats to validity last time. We talked about construct validity and external validity and internal validity, those kinds of things. When you're doing qualitative research, qualitative analysis, fun fact, okay, piece of trivia, you do not refer to threats to validity of qualitative research because all qualitative research can be valid in that sense, but you do talk about threats to credibility of qualitative research. The technical term you use when describing threats to qualitative research is credibility, not validity. And piece of trivia. Did you know this?
But they're the same thing, right?
They're not the same thing. One applies to qualitative, the other one applies to quantitative.
Yeah, the matter is everything.
The intent is
It is.
similar, yes.
I think in the like AI or like the prompting, the prompts are programs too big or big to call it validity.
They fail like that.
Yikes. Lots of people do, I know. I also used to, and I stopped, and I started calling it credibility when I learned that that's the proper
What if a
word for it.
reviewer says you should call it threats to validity, it's not validity, because I don't think it's like very known information.
So you can recommend they take the class. It's all on YouTube. The materials are public. They're on the website. Or they could refer to the original sources where, all of that I cite in all of this. So, lots of sources of information to, correct this misunderstanding.
Is the logic here that these things are probably not valid anyway? Just like my friend called it a scam.
Listen, I will not dignify this with an answer.
You mentioned a statement that all qualitative studies can be valid, but not credible. What do you mean by everything can be valid?
Yeah, so I think validity has a particular meaning that applies to quantitative studies that doesn't transfer directly to qualitative. So in this domain, the analogous term is different. It's credibility. So let me tell you what I mean by credibility. Maybe this will help illuminate some of this nuance. Okay, so credibility. How do we increase credibility? Okay, so credibility means if others are confronted with the experience, can they relate to it? Can they recognize it? How do you do this? A good way to think about credibility is to think about the fit, and I've used this term before, between the respondent's views as you extract them and your representation of them. How well are you capturing their views? And we did discuss in the example papers we read a few good instances of this. Let me skip one ahead. Okay, yeah. So, one practical strategy for increasing or at least assessing fit is member checking. We saw instances of this in at least a couple of the papers we read. I don't remember if we read the Bogart paper. Maybe you've looked at it separately. But the sex workers paper had a really great way to do this. This is a quote from the paper. After we drafted the interview protocol, we hired a sex worker as a consultant to review our protocol for appropriateness and to ensure a member of the community under study was involved in the research to the extent that they desired to be involved, and some was paid market rate. So the researchers were concerned about misrepresenting the views of their informants, their interviewees. So they worked with somebody that understands the language the interviewees are speaking, so to say, right, to help guide them in this process, right? This increases fit. It increases the researcher's ability to represent the views of their participants accurately. The other paper above, the Bogart paper, and somebody had asked about this in class at some point before, but here, after they did the analysis, they went back to their interviewees with a summary and a full draft of sections 4 through 7, along with questions prompting them to look for correctness, areas of agreement or disagreement, i.e. fit, and additional insights from reading about the experiences of other developers and platforms. Okay? So they took their interpretation, the researchers' interpretation of what the interviewees had said, they took that back to the interviewees to check for fit. Okay, this is a really great idea. You see it in the better papers. You don't see it often enough, I think. Right? So this is a way of increasing credibility, right? And reducing, this sort of subjectivity bias, right? Because now you get the people who produce the raw data to have a chance to vet your interpretation of their data. Does this make sense? Do you see why this is a good idea? So hopefully you'll do a lot of this. Okay, so now let's go back. Where were we? Talked about ability. Right. So how else? This was member checking. Member checking. You go back and check with the members. Other strategies to increase credibility here. Spend enough time talking to your participants to give yourself an opportunity to represent their views accurately, right? So your interviews should be as long as needed and so forth, and you should observe them for long enough. Prolonged engagement is about how much time you actually spend with them, in an interview or otherwise. Persistent observation is about how deliberately you observe the things you're actually trying to study. Right? So it's not enough to just hang out with your participants for a long time. You also have to really be able to observe the thing that's the focus of your study, right? Well enough. In addition to this, triangulation is about looking for alternative sources of information or data that you can use to triangulate what you're learning from these interviews. That's data collection triangulation. Researcher triangulation is about getting somebody else on your research team to analyze the same data from the same interviews and see if they read something else into it compared to you, right? Would they arrive at a different interpretation? Yeah.
Can we do part of it during interviews as well? So like when participants are speaking about their views, let's say if you ask a question, is it helpful if we actually respond back to what they said in what I as an interviewer has interpreted?
Yes, so we talked about reflexive prompting last time, I think. So this was an example of that. I would refer you to that deck or the recording. It is a good idea to do that. Yep.
But sometimes, even during this round of interview for the assignment, I felt that after every question, I was like, so from what I'm hearing, this is what your perspective is, that right, kind of a thing.
Yes.
I feel like even they are forming their thoughts about all these different aspects of the impact of these tools on their workflow. So maybe me summarizing it right after every question is somehow biasing them towards what my understanding of their thoughts, because I think the questions are always structured in interviews such that they give people enough room to think in all sorts of cases. So I was doing it because we discussed that in our protocol that we should do it by confirming, but I felt that probably wasn't the best decision.
Yeah, so there's a fine line between reflecting back what they've said to give them an opportunity to clarify or expand, and over interpreting something that they have not said and like planting that back in their heads. I don't know how to fix this other than through practice. We could workshop or critique interview transcript or a protocol to see if there's any ways we could like reduce this potential risk. But otherwise, I think this comes with experience and practice. All right. Okay, we talked about prolonged engagement. But yeah, side note, you've heard maybe of this Hawthorne effect. Have you heard of this? So people will behave differently when they know they're being observed. But this allegedly goes away. So people sort of return to normal behavior, normal for them, after the, I don't know, novelty effect of being observed disappears. There's been a long history of documenting this Hawthorne effect, and also some relatively recent papers that are claiming the evidence for it is very weak. So, take this with a grain of salt. It could be that this is one of these psychology studies that did not replicate very well. I'm not sure, but there's a long history of this kind of concern for this kind of bias. Right, because people will feed you whatever they think you want to hear if they're subject to this bias. Yeah.
I guess, what are like the timeframes that people say are like relevant for like, when the effect of being observed fades away? What is it?
Yeah, so I don't know. I didn't study this carefully enough. In a typical interview like the ones you've been doing that are, I don't know, half hour long or something, when we talked about how to construct a protocol, we talked a bit about this hourglass shape. So, before you dive into the sensitive questions, you start with some harmless things. So that's a way to get people comfortable in the right headspace to be able to talk more openly and honestly about whatever it is you're after, right? So that's why you don't start directly with the important questions. Some of it is also this, I assume. Okay. We talked about persistent observation, triangulation. We talked a bit about member checking. We talked about. Yeah, transferability is basically analogous. You can think of this to a generalizability in, I don't know, sample-based quantitative research. So to what extent would these findings transfer to somewhere else? This is why the best practice is to include quotes in your paper as part of your reporting, as well as to hopefully include a lot more of these details in supplementary materials that we talked about, the memos, etc., maybe more quotes, maybe the transcripts themselves, so that people can assess for themselves, not based on your several layers abstracted away interpretation that's in the paper, but rather based on the verbatim quotes from the participant, the extent to which whatever they're saying may also be applicable somewhere else. Okay, so sticking close to the ground, so to say, like having these verbatim quotes, both in the paper as well as in more detail and supplementary, is a good way to increase transferability. Like people can assess, readers can assess if similar scenarios, right, are applicable in their context too. Okay, right, documentation, audit trails. We talked a lot about keeping all of these documents throughout the process. So creating an audit trail follows the decision trail regarding your methodological choices. So this is where rigor comes from also, by the way. Right, could somebody else arrive at similar conclusions starting from the same raw data as you have, right? And you want the answer to that to be yes. It doesn't have to be the same conclusion. There's some degree of subjectivity, right? But if right, I think the point is not contradictory, right? I think you want to be in a place where if I look at something you've analyzed, I should not arrive at a contradictory conclusion to the one you've drawn. So that's sort of a low confidence or credibility study, if that's the case. Right, so a long list of examples of things you can keep an audit trail of, keep records of. Right, and I gave an example of the one some of our audit trail here for the study. This is the description of the methodology we followed in that very same paper. I'm putting this as an example. we tried to be very detailed when we wrote this up, about all of these different steps as part of this, so this was a entirely qualitative paper, right? The whole focus of the paper was this qualitative analysis. So we went into a lot of detail on how we performed this qualitative analysis, right? It wasn't the mixed methods thing where, the interviews were a small part of a bigger thing, right? It was the sole focus of the paper. So we went into a lot of detail also on how we did the analysis. And I think this level of detail in your reporting is something to aim for, if you're doing this kind of work, right? You could study this as an example of how we kept track of all these different things. B, we were deliberate about all these choices. C, we were very transparent in our reporting of these steps in the analysis. By no means the only example. I'm sure you'll find better ones, but this is just one that I happen to be familiar with. Teresa.
Stop. 5. Is it again by saturation that you stop here?
Yeah, good point. I don't know if saturation. Yes, I would hope so. I would hope saturation because, right, we're saying we stopped after 35 and fixed the code book such that only one of the researchers could then go and code the remaining transcripts on their own with this existing code book. I think we do say something about how maybe a few changes were still necessary to the code book. So that suggests, close to saturation at 35, but not if we had to add more codes, right? If we had to add to the code book or refine things, right, when doing the remaining ones, that means we weren't quite there. And it doesn't seem like we had a very explicit criterion for saturation here. So that's a good point. So you can still improve on the methodology here, right? So having an explicit saturation criterion, reporting on that, having that transparent would have made this better in this case. All right, so I guess I will leave you. So much for doing the hands-on. We'll do the hands-on maybe on Thursday, right? Because we'll have more time. But I will leave you with this example checklist. This is an easy thing for you to refer back to, a checklist of things you can, check off as you're doing this kind of analysis to increase credibility. Marco.
This from like an actual paper, or is this kind of just that?
No, don't. This is from one of the things I cite here in the readings. I don't remember which one. Yeah, this is from one of the sources for the class. It is from one of these sources right now off the top of my head. I don't remember which one, but yeah, we can find that out. All right, so I'll see you on Thursday. We'll actually do live qualitative analysis in class. Sound good? All right, thanks.